So right now in the territories, as you know, the peace process between the Israelis and Palestinians is stuck. And although it's stuck and stalemated, the situation on the ground is actually not static. In the upcoming issue of Foreign Affairs, Daniel Byman and I write about the rise of violence among extremist Israeli settlers in the West Bank, targeting innocent Palestinians, but also Israeli authorities. And what we're arguing there is that this has to be highlighted, especially because of the stalemate on the ground, because the situation is likely to continue for quite a while in significant portions of the West Bank where Israel controls it. Well, in the past, the settler community was smaller and much more disciplined, and the vast majority of settlers who oppose any kinds of violence against innocent Palestinians, and it should be clear that still the vast majority of settlers oppose this violence and are peaceful, they had authority, the settler leadership had authority over extremists in their own camp. But in recent years, in the past decade or two, the settler community has grown dramatically in size. It's become much more diverse in its religious and ideological makeup. And especially in 2005, Israel pulled out all the Israeli settlements from the Gaza Strip. And this left a very deep mark, a trauma, among settlers. In settler parlance is called the expulsion from the Gaza Strip. This low-level violence, in fact, is properly called terrorism, and the ones who have called this terrorism are in fact the Israeli leadership themselves. Israeli officers and Israeli ministers have debated whether or not to designate the perpetrators of this violence as terrorists, and we think they should. The reason this is terrorism is not because of the act itself being as dramatic as a suicide bombing, but because the goal of this act is to use psychological means, terror, to gain political advantage of different kinds. And what the perpetrators are trying to do is to target innocent Palestinians or Israeli soldiers or others to make a change in Israeli policy. Israel has in the past designated Israeli and Jewish groups as terrorists, especially a party called Kach. But this is the first time that Israeli officials, both officers and ministers, are considering calling these low-level kinds of violence, but routine and very dangerous kind of violence, as terrorism. And this is very important in the implications it has for law enforcement and for the ability of the Israeli authorities to coordinate their effort to stem this kind of violence. When it's a very dramatic kind of terrorism, then it is often easier for the authorities to target it and to stop it. And in the past, Israel has done this very successfully. But this kind of routine low-level violence is still very dangerous and needs to be dealt with very, very seriously, especially because we expect Israel to continue and control Area C in the West Bank for many years to come, so long as the peace process is in a deadlock. Well, the process at present is stalemated. It's at a complete deadlock. This violence has a variety of different effects on the possibility of a future resumption of a peace process or any kind of diplomatic negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. First, this kind of violence emboldens the extremists on the Palestinian side. It paints the moderates, such as the current leadership in Ramallah, as weak, as unable to stop violence against their own civilians. And it paints the Israelis in very dark lights in the eyes of Palestinians. The U.S. has a role in two ways. First, it should encourage Israel to take the steps that it needs. And the Israeli leadership knows the steps that are necessary, but there needs to be more political will, and the U.S. can encourage this. The second is that the U.S., we argue, should also consider designating the perpetrators, the individuals behind these kinds of attacks, as terrorists. This is important not just symbolically, it's important in terms of law enforcement and in terms of coordinating counterterrorism, especially preventing U.S. citizens from sending funding to the individuals who would be designated as terrorists. It's also important because the U.S. has a very important role to play as the main chaperone of the now deadlocked peace process. And if the U.S. hopes to lead a future resumption of talks, it's very important that the situation on the ground in the interim doesn't backslide.